He was hired to drive, a quiet man in a crisp uniform, the kind most people never look twice at. But behind the wheel sat someone the world had underestimated more times than he could count. The white CEO in the back seat didn't see him as a man, just another employee meant to open doors and disappear. He laughed at his accent, mocked his manners, and assumed silence meant ignorance. What he didn't know was that the man he was mocking carried something far greater than a title or a suit. He carried knowledge, discipline, and the power to speak to the world in 9 different languages. One meeting. $1 billion deal. One moment that would turn arrogance into shock, and silence into respect. Because when the room began to crumble, and every executive panicked, the driver they ignored became the only one who could save it all. And what happened next? No one in that room ever laughed again. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments before we begin. Malik Johnson had never cared about titles. He wasn't the kind of man who needed recognition to know his worth. Every morning, he ironed his uniform until the creases were sharp, polished his shoes until they reflected light, and drove through the city before sunrise. To most, he was just a driver, quiet, reliable, invisible. But beneath that calm exterior lived a man who'd traveled the world, studied cultures, and mastered 9 languages. Life had humbled him. Years earlier, he'd been a translator for international organizations, but when his mother fell ill, he returned home to take care of her. The driver's job wasn't a step down to him, it was stability. A way to keep going while keeping his promise to family. His employer, Richard Hayes, couldn't have been more different. The CEO of a global tech firm, Richard was the type who believed money equaled power and manners equaled weakness. To him, Malik was just another face behind a wheel, polite, quiet, and easily ignored. But Malik noticed everything. The rushed meetings. The whispered arguments. The upcoming deal that would either make or break Richard's company. And as fate would have it, Malik would soon find himself at the center of that deal, where one moment of arrogance would reveal who truly understood power. The day started like any other. Malik arrived early, checked the car, and waited outside the gleaming glass tower where Richard Hayes ran his empire. Inside, executives rushed through revolving doors, their badges swinging like medals. Outside, Malik stood by quietly, invisible to them all. That morning, Richard stepped out with his usual confidence, tailored suit, polished smile, and the air of someone who believed the world owed him its attention. He barely nodded at Malik before tossing a comment over his shoulder about drivers knowing their place. Malik smiled politely, the way he always did. But in that moment, a faint ache returned, an old, familiar reminder of what it felt like to be dismissed because of the color of his skin. They were headed to Switzerland for a high-stakes negotiation. A billion-dollar merger that could save Richard's company from collapse. As Malik drove through the city toward the airport, Richard and his executives laughed in the back seat, mocking accents of foreign partners, treating diversity like a punchline. Malik kept his eyes on the road, his mind heavy but calm. He'd seen this kind of arrogance before, it always came before a fall. When they arrived, Malik carried their bags without complaint. At the private terminal, one of Richard's assistants mistook him for airport staff and ordered him to fetch coffee. Richard didn't correct her. He just smirked. By the time they landed in Geneva, the tension was tangible. Malik wasn't supposed to follow them to the meeting, but a last-minute logistics issue left him waiting in the same building. He sat quietly in the lounge, reading the financial reports he'd found in the back seat earlier. He understood every word. He'd once written reports like that, before life had taken a different turn. Through the glass walls, he could see the boardroom. The meeting had begun, and it wasn't going well. Richard's confidence was cracking. The foreign investors were frustrated, switching between languages he didn't understand. His translator struggled, missing nuances, mistranslating figures. The investors began exchanging glances, displeased, impatient. Richard's voice grew louder, defensive. He didn't realize the deal was slipping away. His arrogance, once his armor, was now his downfall. Malik watched from outside, heart pounding. He knew exactly what was happening. He could hear enough to understand the chaos unfolding inside that room. He thought about staying silent, it wasn't his place to intervene. But then he remembered the way Richard had laughed, the way people like him were taught to shrink themselves to survive. And that's when it happened. One of the investors, furious and ready to walk out, stood up. Richard froze, words failing him. The translator looked helpless. And just as the doors began to open for their exit, Malik took a breath and stood up. What happened next would not only change the course of that meeting, it would change how everyone in that building saw him forever. Malik stepped into the boardroom just as chaos reached its peak. The air was thick with tension, papers scattered, voices clashing, and $1 billion deal slipping through trembling fingers. All eyes turned as the man in a driver's uniform quietly entered the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Richard's jaw tightened, his face flushing with irritation. "This is not the time," he muttered under his breath, waving Malik off like a nuisance. But Malik didn't move. He looked directly at the investors, his calm cutting through the noise. Then, with perfect fluency, he addressed them in their own language. Heads lifted. Conversations froze. Every word that followed was sharp, confident, and precise. He translated their frustrations, clarified the misunderstandings, and explained the terms Richard's team had fumbled. In seconds, the dynamic shifted. The investors leaned forward, listening. They began nodding, responding with respect that didn't exist moments ago. Richard's expression changed from annoyance to disbelief, then to something darker, fear. The man he'd laughed at, mocked, and treated like a servant was now commanding the very room he had lost control of. Malik moved effortlessly between languages, German, French, and Mandarin, each word delivered with grace. The executives who once saw him as invisible now scrambled to keep up. The investors, impressed by his intellect and composure, began to reconsider. If this moment already has you hooked, make sure to hit subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Richard tried to reclaim authority, interrupting Malik with a forced smile, but the damage was done. The room had already chosen who to listen to. Every time Malik spoke, confidence returned to the table. Every time Richard spoke, silence followed. By the time the final proposal was reviewed, the lead investor turned, not to Richard, but to Malik. "Thank you," he said in English, "you saved this deal." Applause filled the room, but Malik didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, stepping back toward the door. Richard sat frozen, humiliated. 4 years, he'd measured worth by skin color, money, and title. And in one meeting, that illusion shattered. Malik turned to leave, his face calm but his heart pounding. He had done what needed to be done, not for revenge, but for dignity. And as he stepped out of that boardroom, the same people who once overlooked him rose to their feet. For the first time, they saw him, not as a driver, not as background, but as the man who saved them all. What Richard felt in that silence wasn't just shame, it was realization. The man he underestimated had just rewritten the balance of power. When the meeting ended, Malik didn't wait for praise. He slipped out quietly, walking past the glass walls that had once separated him from the world of power. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn gold. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He had walked into that room as a driver, and walked out as the man who had saved an empire. Hours later, Richard found him by the car, still standing straight, hands folded behind his back. There was no smirk now, no condescending tone, just silence. Richard tried to thank him, to patch the hole pride had torn open. But Malik only nodded. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Just remember what respect looks like." Then he opened the car door for him, not as a servant, but as a man in control of his own dignity. Word spread quickly through the company. The story of the driver who spoke 9 languages traveled from boardrooms to break rooms. Some praised him, others were ashamed they'd never looked past the uniform. But Malik didn't crave recognition. He knew change didn't happen in applause, it happened in awareness. The deal closed successfully. The investors credited Malik's intervention, and soon, he was offered a position in the company's global relations division. But before accepting, he asked one question: will this position come with respect, or just a title. That day, something shifted. Not just in that company, but in everyone who witnessed it. Because Malik's story wasn't just about saving a deal, it was about confronting a mindset. About proving that intelligence, value, and humanity don't come dressed in privilege. Maybe the real question isn't how Malik changed that boardroom, but how many more boardrooms still need to change. Because respect shouldn't be earned through miracles. It should be the starting point of every human interaction. So the next time you see someone and think you already know their story, pause. Look again. Because behind every uniform, every label, there's a Malik waiting to be seen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories that open eyes.